I have a name. I have a face. I have a choice. Still a part of community. Therefore I choose to lift my voice. I have a name. I have a face. I have a choice. Still a part of community. Therefore I choose to lift my voice. The lowest time in my life was the 6 months prior to coming into prison and the 6 months or so inside. At the time, I thought I knew myself, but I was so consumed with the street life, the drugs, the illusion of fast money, that I really didn't have any clue who I was. I'm in prison now for a double homicide that occurred during the course of a robbery. And unlike some guys, most really, who look at coming to prison as a badge of honor or street credibility, I feel so disgraced, so below zero. You know, I could remember being in a cell on Rikers Island and having the strangest feeling like I had been there before, even though I hadn't. It took me a couple of days to realize that it wasn't the cell, it was me. I'd spent most of my life creating a mental, psychological imprisonment that now that I was in a real prison, it felt familiar and maybe even more comforting. Because now, at last, I could see the walls, bars, and locked doors. Whereas before, the hardest thing about the mental imprisonment and the sociological, to some extent, was the appearance that I was free. Alejo Rodriguez, 86A0607. Otisville Correctional Facility.
Welcome and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much once again for coming together. We have an amazing plenary panel in store. I'm going to just say a couple of brief words of introduction, and then I'll introduce our panelists. My name is Dan Hosang. I'm a very proud board member of the Alliance for a Just Society and the Institute for Pragmatic Practice, and I'm also at the University of Oregon in Eugene. One of the tasks clearly in front of us, just from this last piece and across the day, has been that in a country that puts people in cages at a higher rate than any society that our world has known, is the work that we have to do to remember the intellect, the aspirations, the politics of people who have served time and people who are incarcerated. And in addition, our panel today is speaking to us about how those developments and those dimensions and this phenomenon affects all of us. It affects us in different ways, but it has dramatic effects on our society in general. So our panel is titled Capitalism, Neoliberalism, and Control. And in particular, it's asking us to think about those connections between the massive growth in incarceration and immigration control and our very notions of freedom, democracy, economy, citizenship, and possibility. Three really amazing panelists that I'll introduce now. And Denisha also mentioned that unfortunately Dr. Cornel West, who was scheduled to be on the panel, was pulled away with a family emergency and won't be joining us today. We have a wonderful panel, though, I assure you. So let me first introduce, so we have three panelists, Pramila Jayapal, Vince Warren, and Joy James. I'm going to introduce each of them. They'll talk for about 10 to 15 minutes each, and then we'll have some time for questions and discussion before we break for dinner. So first, Pramila. Pramila comes out of local immigrant rights and human rights organizing work, in particular in Seattle, Washington, where she was founder of a very, very important organization called One America. We might remember even 20 years ago when the kind of coordinated and orchestrated attacks around immigration began, we had very little infrastructure at the local level to respond to them. And certainly after 9/11, when the increases in vigilante violence, that was just starting to begin. Now, when we have May Day and we have lobbying in DC around immigration reform, we see a much more comprehensive network of groups. But even 10 years ago, that was in its infancy. And it was through the labor of people like Pramila and other activists that local organizing and political efforts around the human rights of immigrants were launched into national consciousness. So she did very important work there that transitioned also into increasing the vote among new citizens, and is more recently co-chaired an effort called We Belong Together that's both lifting up the gender dimensions of immigration reform, but also getting us to think about the connections between families and what families are owed and deserved, immigration policy, gender, and political activism. So her and our very intentional effort to try to link immigration control and incarceration means that the voices of the immigrant rights movement, as it's developed recently, are critical to this discussion. So please join me in welcoming Pramila Jayapal.
Thank you, and it's really wonderful to be on this panel with Vince and Joy and Dan. As Dan said, I come out of really grassroots organizing, but I am going to just take a step back a little bit, because I think sometimes when we're in the trenches, we forget about some of the big forces that really shape and drive the consequences that we deal with on the ground. And so when I was thinking about this panel, I was thinking that, you know, capitalism and neoliberalism have this really seductive ring, not for the people in this room, but for a lot of people out there in the world. And the reason is because they both falsely imply that we can have a type of equality that transcends race and class. This idea that if you're exceptional, if you work hard, then you too can enter this money pipeline, this capitalistic society. You can make it, you can become anything you want. So if you don't, then it's really about you, right? So that idea is pretty sexy and seductive out there. And I think that both systems, both neoliberalism and capitalism, kind of rest on three ideas. One, that money is the great liberator. Two, that the private sector is the great and oh so efficient implementer. And three, that punishment is the great rationalizer for inhumane treatment and for control. And not only is all of that a lie, but it's also incredibly dangerous because it stops us from looking at the core issues of race and class within those systems. And those are really the things around which so much else gets built. So I guess I see capitalism and neoliberalism as a way to build a scaffolding for a system that not only supports mass incarceration, but actually creates the alternative for whatever comes, even if we were to dismantle the system of incarceration. And when I say that, how many of you have read Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow? So you know how she talks about in that these systems of control, right? Slavery, Jim Crow, incarceration, and with the falling of each of those systems, something else came up in that transition. Each of those arose because there was now no ability to have that system of control, so something else had to take the place. So ultimately, capitalism and neoliberalism kind of function as a way to ensure that we can not only support those systems of control, but build other ones that are still based on those same concepts that are within those. So within the immigration system, which is the system I know best, we are supporting and building that scaffolding in two ways in my mind. First of all, we're liberalizing the drug laws and the sentencing laws, and so that's a really wonderful thing, and that's a victory that deserves to be celebrated because a lot of people have worked very hard on that. But we've replaced those gains with this other massive system of incarceration within the immigration system. Right now, 400,000 people, 400,000 immigrants a year are detained. There are 250 facilities, including county and local jails, that are part of that center. Many of those jails, by the way, would have shut down if it weren't for the immigration system that then supplied more people to fill those jails. And it's a cost of billions of dollars to the taxpayers, which doesn't, by the way, include any of the costs of the militarization of the border. I mean, we're just talking about the incarceration system here for immigrants. Second, anybody play Monopoly? You know that system, right? When you play Monopoly, if you have more, you get more. Like, I always thought Monopoly was such an unfair game because if you had money, you could buy more property. If you had more property, you could tax more people that landed on the property. So I don't let my son play Monopoly. But you know, this is the same thing with the immigration detention system. So it has helped fuel a rise in the capital market, in the stock market, even when the stock market would otherwise see a depression. So just as an example, from 2007 to 2009, when the S&P 500 dropped by 28%, the Corrections Corporation of America's earnings increased by 18%. And this is sort of a follow-on on the last excellent panel that I attended on the CCA, but even during the last recession, CCA's stock price doubled since 2010. And today, a quarter to a third of GEO and CCA, which are the two biggest corporations in the private prison business, have increased dramatically. So that has just allowed them, it's the game of Monopoly, that has allowed them to put more money into lobbying. So over the last decade, they've spent about $45 million lobbying DC politicians in order to then get more beds. And we talked about this provision in the last panel, but some of you know that it was Senator Robert Byrd that actually put in, a Democrat, very anti-immigrant Democrat, who put in the provision that said 35,000 or so beds that's being interpreted as a mandate for how many people, immigrants, need to be detained daily. That is a quota system for detention. So prison corporations, I think, are actually becoming more reliable investments than government treasuries. Certainly with the shutdown, that's probably true. But that's where people are making money, not just the prison corporations, but all of the investors who put money into that system. Third, as has happened in the past, immigration plays into the capitalist system and makes for really strange bedfellows. So I work very heavily on immigration reform. Guess who has helped to push public opinion? It's true that public opinion around immigration reform and the need for immigration reform has changed. But part of who has pushed that public opinion is corporations, right? Business is right in there with us on the fight for immigration reform. They weren't, because it was actually really, really profitable to have a failed immigration system, because if you have a failed immigration system, you have cheap labor. If you have cheap labor, you have greater profits. And so until it became untenable for them, because public opinion on the right really moved so that this idea of having, illegal immigrants in the United States became something that was a flashpoint for the conservative right. Until that happened, and until the administration started to crack down on businesses that were hiring undocumented immigrants, business was not for this, but now they are, because this is still the way that they're going to continue to get their cheap labor. And then fourth, that migration is really fueled by our foreign policy and our trade decisions. I mean, we never talk about, well, too few people talk about migration in the context of immigration reform, but the reality is that our whole system globally is a system of migration. There's 1 billion people that are on the move today across the United States, across the world. And about 230 million of those people live in the United States. I'm one of them. I was born in India. I came here when I was 16. But this idea of people cracking down on immigrants and migrants across the world is one of the biggest problems that the world is facing, I think. And it's always funny to think about how we collectively in the public debate, again, not in this room, but the idea of globalization and free trade is embraced, and yet the free flow of people, free flow of labor is not at all. So our best arguments, I understand today, around stopping incarceration, and this came up in the last panel, have been around the monetary costs of incarceration. I think that that's good, but I think it's very important that we don't stop there, and that we make sure that we layer other arguments onto that, because it doesn't get at the underlying questions of human compassion, dignity, love, respect, care for each other if we just focus on the cost argument. And as Michelle Alexander argues in the new Jim Crow, you could actually dismantle the prison system, but you would still, or you could dismantle the drug laws, for example, or reduce sentencing, but you would still have the label and the cultural identity of people as being bad, right? They would still be bad people in a lot of public ideas, or a lot of public opinion. And so that's this, but this acceptance that these are people that somehow need to be punished, at least in the immigration system, is part of the reason why in the Senate bill, any bill that's passed in Congress will include a lot of incarceration and militarization of the border, because there is still, even though public opinion has shifted on the need for immigration reform, it has not shifted on the idea that these are lawbreakers, these are people who have done something wrong and therefore need to be punished and controlled. So it still fits into the same narrative of control that will still continue to build, I think, a broader system of something that replaces incarceration. So in an economy that struggles for good jobs, I think the other thing that's really important for us to think about is, on the positive side, what an opportunity it is for us to build coalitions across Black and Brown, because what has traditionally happened with jobs, and by putting this in a capitalist context and economic context, is that prison building and prison, and people hunting and cell blocking is good for jobs. So what does that do? That means that just as we did with plantation labor, dividing poor whites and poor blacks and kind of creating a division there, we are now creating divisions where other people are buying into the incarceration system that really should be with us, right? So Asians, I'm Asian, a lot of Asian Americans, a lot of African Americans, a lot of white folks who say these people really do need to have some punishment doled out to them. And so I think we need to really make sure that in our arguments, we are creating arguments that go beyond just the economic pieces of the system. Otherwise, we will be trapped by our own arguments. So let me just say that in terms of now what, because this can get to be a really depressing topic, and all of us, I think, are activists, and by the very nature of activists, we're optimists. Otherwise, we wouldn't do this work. I think conferences like this and the ability for us to really talk about these big issues, so that as we go back into our communities and we make arguments to people, our friends, people that we deal with every day who are in detention, incarceration, who are really struggling, as well as our allies, that we can start to build a more cohesive argument that is really about love and a non-monetized way of seeing the world, because these systems only operate if we buy into them. Second, I think that we do need to celebrate the efforts that we have to limit the forms of control that are out there. So I think of course, felon enfranchisement as one of those efforts. The legislature in California passed a law which was then vetoed by Jerry Brown, which really didn't get a lot of attention that he vetoed it, because he also did some good things for immigrants at the same time around domestic workers and other areas. But the law that would allow legal permanent residents to vote in certain elections, that was a really important way of saying we have a democracy that's not really a democracy because all these people are here and they don't have a voice. Restoring driver's licenses, I'm proud that Washington State has always been one of 2 states that has preserved the ability for people to have driver's licenses regardless of immigration status. Why is that important? Because the driver's license is part of how your identity gets defined in this country. It allows you to buy a house, it allows you to get credit, it allows you to do all these other things that are part of the capitalist society that you then, and it allows you to enter places, allows you to travel and move and be mobile. That's very important. And then I think that the whole push for civil detention to be civil detention, probably everybody in this room understands that immigration is a civil system. It is not a criminal system. And that is a very important concept when you think about incarceration of immigrants now happening in jails and in facilities that are designed like prisons. You don't get visiting rights, you speak to people through through glass, you are shackled sometimes, you don't have access to medical care. And the Heartland Alliance did a really great study on Australia and the push that Australia had to really transform its detention system from a very criminalizing system in the sense of identity. How do we think of people as being good or bad people? And then what do we do to make them feel that way? What are the conditions that support that identity? And really transforming that into a civil system. And there is in the Senate bill that was passed on immigration reform a big component of alternatives to detention, thanks to Detention Watch Network and DRUM and many others that have been working on this for so long. Very important beginnings, I think. Third, I think the dismantling of existing systems do have to happen. The drug laws, the sentencing laws, changes in all of those things are really important. But then we need to make sure that as those get dismantled, we create the new system. Because in every other transition that's happened, if a system has been dismantled, it creates a lot of space. And into that space then emerges either a good option or a bad option. And so far they've been pretty bad options, right? We went from slavery to Jim Crow to mass incarceration. So it's up to us to really figure out how we fill that space with something that creates, and this is where I'll end, that creates our ability to really embrace and see each other as human beings that exist separate from any monetized situation, that aren't in the business of being controlled or controlling others, that aren't in the business of punishing or being punished, but actually are in the process of learning and growing as human beings in a society that is a collective society that lives together. So thank you, and I look forward to the thoughts and comments.
Thank you, Pramila. And what a wonderful formulation that we have to think about asserting non-monetized ways of seeing the world, and that our challenge of transforming institutions actually is also a challenge of the ways we see and project ideas about morality and connection, not just about policy reform. And that's certainly something we'll return to in the discussion. Our next panelist is Vincent Warren, who's the executive director of the Center for Constitutional Rights. I was thinking, this is an age when all the debates we hear about of the Supreme Court and litigation often focus on returning to some sacred origins of the Constitution, as if our laws are not living, contested, politicized obligations we have. And CCR is at the forefront of not just its litigation and advocacy work around a whole range of issues, presidential powers, Guantanamo, LGBT rights, but actually asserting new frameworks of legal morality and obligation, using the courts to do precisely what Pramila's challenged us to do, which is to popularize alternative ways of thinking about our obligation to one another. Before that, Vincent was a staff attorney at the ACLU, also doing really important legal work around affirmative action and other racial justice issues, and was involved with some observation with the Truth and Reconciliation commissions in South Africa. So brings a long sweep of racial justice and civil rights, politicized history to this debate. Please join me in welcoming Vince Warren.
Thank you very much, Dan. It is wonderful to be here. Pramila, I really enjoyed your remarks, and I agreed with them very much, and I think that there's a piece that I can echo and add. I wanted to, if I could, center us in the framework that Pramila set forth about slavery to Jim Crow to incarceration, and to center us around the concept of humanity. And by doing that, I just want to read from an excerpt from James Baldwin's The Fire Next Time. I know you've all read it, but you probably haven't read this part recently. The past, the Negro's past of rope, fire, torture, castration, infanticide, rape, death, and humiliation, fear day and night, fear as deep as the marrow of the bone, doubt that he was worthy of life, since everyone around him denied it, sorrow for his women, his kinfolk, his children, who needed his protection, and whom he could not protect, rage, hatred, and murder, hatred for white men, so deep it often turned against him and his own, and made all love, all trust, all joy impossible. This is the message that has spread through the streets and the tenements and the prisons, through the narcotics wards and past the filth and sadism of mental hospitals, to a people from whom everything has been taken away, including, most crucially, their sense of their own worth. People cannot live without this sense. They will do anything, whatever, to regain it. This is why the most dangerous creation of any society is that man who has nothing to lose. And I thought about this piece as a way to talk with you about how our society dehumanizes with a range of criminal structures, including immigration, stop and frisk, solitary confinement, and the death penalty. But I wanted to do it in a way that is not 8.5 minutes of doom and gloom, but to think about it more in the context of an activist legal strategy, which is something that we do at the Center for Constitutional Rights. And I'll start off by saying that I didn't know when I was a young guy and I wanted to be a civil rights lawyer more than anything. I did not know that the law, particularly constitutional law, does not raise humanity. In and of itself, the law as a tool does not raise humanity. And I was very fortunate to come to the center because the center has understood that from the very first cases that it did in the 1960s, and has strived to partner with the entities and the power that can humanize. And those are the activists, those are the organizers, those are the religious communities and the people that center the human voice in all of the despair that we're all trying to fight. And the law can really do two things that we have to be very clear about. One is that it can work to compel, to activate greater incarceration. That is a job of the law. It can do so, of course, with the sentencing laws and the stop and frisk policies and the things and the secure communities policies and things that we've been talking about here. But it can also do so, interestingly enough, by starving the constitutional systems that it actually creates. And so if you think about the right to counsel, in any system where you have poor people that are under the thumb of the government, the ability of having a lawyer is a very important tool to fight that kind of repression. That although there is a constitutional right to counsel in criminal law, across the country, states are starving the public defender system to the point where in a lot of places it becomes completely ineffective, that there is no meaningful ability for poor people to challenge even the basic tenets of their own incarceration. In the immigration system, as Pramila set forth, even though everything that we hear about immigration from state houses across the country is criminal in nature, it is a criminalization of communities, there's no question about that. But the law itself is actually civil law, and because of that, there is no right to counsel, to lawyers to be able to help individuals in those situations without paying for themselves. So the system actually can compel much greater incarceration. Now, the other thing that the system does is that it can provide an ability to change systems. It's called systemic reform litigation, a lot of which CCR does. But the law itself can actually maintain the status quo, and this sort of brings us back to the humanization piece. We are called the Center for Constitutional Rights, it's true, or some people say the center of what's left of your constitutional rights. But we have also, part of our mandate and part of our mission is to look at human rights as the human rights framework of what's happening. And human rights does the exact opposite of constitutional rights. Constitutional rights pits the rights and responsibilities of the individual against the rights and responsibilities of the state. It is a balancing test. The state is always in the balancing test. The judges are paid by the state. There are lawyers and very well-paid lawyers that are arguing for the state. The judge will balance the state's interest against the individual interest, and you don't have to be a Philadelphian lawyer to know that if a judge is balancing your rights against the rights of the entire state of New York, the city of New York, the state of Louisiana, you're probably going to lose. But human rights does the exact opposite thing. Human rights centers the discussion around the basic fundamental dignity of the human being, and it completely shifts the paradigm. It completely shifts it. And so while we have a challenge, and the challenge is that very much like most places in the United States, that people think that human rights only applies to the other guys, in Syria, Sierra Leone, and it doesn't apply to us. It's the same challenge within the legal system, that most courts don't recognize and understand the role and their responsibilities under human rights. However, that doesn't stop us from aligning our legal strategies with the organizing strategies, where the organizing strategies are very centered on the rights and the humanity of the individual. So a couple of examples of how lawyering can help. One example is name it, and another example of it is change it. So the name it examples are in our role, with respect to our role in immigration, the Center for Constitutional Rights, we've done a number of home raids cases, and we also were involved in a great effort with the National Day Laborers Organizing Network, in which we challenged, through a Freedom of Information Act request, the massive expanding Secure Communities program that was being ushered in by the Obama administration. The goal of that program was to get all 1,300 local jails to do immigration enforcement, essentially, by turning over criminal information to the immigration officials, so that if you were brought in on a minor charge, that they would grease the wheels so it would speed and expedite your deportation through, or your removal through deportation proceedings. It's essentially the merging of the local police function and the immigration function. Our task in that was not to try to change that system, but to name it. And this is where we took the lead from Endelon. And Endelon said to us, this is a massive policy that is being held largely in secret. We don't know anything about it. We have a difficult time organizing around it. So the strategy was to get the government to name it, to give us documents that would explain the program and explain the rights, responsibilities under the program, so that organizers could go ahead and move it. And that's what we did. As a result, we got thousands, hundreds of thousands of pages of documents. The government completely clean about this program. A federal judge said that it was abundantly clear to her that there was misdirection, miscommunication, and she didn't say it, but she meant outright lies about the program. And that it allowed, and we were able to partner with groups around the country to take that fight to individual states to be able to push back against secure communities. That's one aspect of naming it. Another aspect of naming it is in a recent report that we did with respect to the death penalty, and this goes to that monetarization argument. We at CCR said, we are not the first organization to think about the death penalty, and we won't be the last, but what we can offer here is a human rights framing of the death penalty. Let's see if we can name this system in a way that hundreds of countries around the world have, as a system that oppresses, that tortures, and that violates the basic human rights of people by its very existence and practice. And I'll be honest with you, initially we met with a fair amount of resistance because there are extraordinary campaigns going around the country that have shifted and have changed and have created moratoriums on the death penalty, that have eliminated the death penalty. And the main arguments there, and it's true as anybody knows from political activity, that you're only going to get as far as the most conservative right-wing dog will allow you to get on an issue. So for the most conservative right-wing dog, you have to convince him or her of a number of things. That is actually God's plan to be able to not have the death penalty, that it will cost less money to have to not have the death penalty, and things like that. So it is a very good strategy, but it does tend to lose the broader message of what we're trying to do, which is that it is wrong because it dehumanizes. And so we did a study of the death penalty in Louisiana and California, based on a human rights framework. We picked those two states. California has the most people on death row by far, more than twice as many as as Florida, the second leading state. They have 720 people on death row. We picked Louisiana because Louisiana has a long and storied history of racial suppression and racism. We've heard the stories about how black people are executed more often than white people. They're executed more often for killing white people than white people are for killing black people. But you probably didn't know that the last time a white man was executed for a crime against a black man was in 1752. That's what we're talking about. And no amount of monetarization, no amount of budget discussions, no amount of those types of messages is going to change that fact or address those facts. And so we wanted to be able to name things like that in our report. The other part is change it. And there is one thing that we are in the process of changing, and another one that we are trying very hard to. Let me start with solitary confinement. We at CCR have mounted a huge challenge to solitary confinement in Pelican Bay Prison in Northern California. Why Pelican Bay Prison? Because California seems to really like to incarcerate the most people that they possibly can, relative to other states. The most people in solitary confinement on the planet, at least in the United States, are in Pelican Bay Prison. So we challenged that legally. We use a human rights framing for our organizing purposes. We have a constitutional framing within the context of our litigation, but our strategy has been to raise the voices of the people within solitary confinement. And frankly, the thing that has been most heartening and the most inspiring is that that the men in solitary don't need CCR or lawyers to give them a voice, to take their voice. They went on hunger strike. They spoke out, and we were able to help amplify the voices with the platform that we have with CCR. So that case is in mid-progress, and we are hoping to have a class of literally thousands of men who are in solitary confinement, some for as much as 35 years. And that's 35 years being in confinement 23 hours a day, 22 or 23 hours a day, completely isolated from other folks. It drives people crazy. Lastly, another example of the Change It strategy, I'm very happy to say, has been what I feel has been a very successful, not just a litigation effort, but a litigation organizing and advocacy effort here in New York, where we got a ruling from a federal court judge that the stop and frisk practice by the New York City Police Department is unconstitutional. Thank you. And the numbers there are astounding. You probably know them, but of the over 5 million people that have been stopped by the New York City Police Department, 87% black and Latino. And the police department has told us repeatedly, this is because we need this program to get guns off the street. But when you look at the numbers, when you look at their own statistics, their hit rate, their rate of getting guns off the street is, for all of those stops, 0.014% of those stops result in gun seizures. It's minuscule. And in fact, the experts were telling the court that they would have a much better job of getting guns off the street if they just randomly searched everybody in New York City. Yeah, the facts don't lie. I want to close, though, by coming back to humanization, and I don't want to give the impression that this tremendous victory was done by the lawyers alone. It most certainly was not. We are very privileged to be a part of Communities United for Police Reform, which is an extraordinary, expansive coalition of groups around New York City that have come together around the idea that policing communities is criminalized. The way that police is doing it now, it's criminalizing communities. It is black, brown communities, it is LGBTI communities, it is Asian communities, it is all sorts of communities. And there's a gender analysis to this as well. And all of those groups together, coupled with our support with the litigation, got this done. And getting to the question of building the world that we want to look like afterwards, one of the most promising pieces of this effort has been that the judge ordered a remedy. Usually when you win these kind of cases, the judge says, fix the following 15 things, and then you're off to the races. But the judge said, no, this time we want community input. The judge said in her order, I have never seen this in a legal document from a federal judge, where the judge said that the communities that are the most affected by this practice need to have a meaningful voice in figuring out how we fix it. That's the promise of what we have. That would not have happened if we had not had groups that were bringing the voices of community members into the courtroom as we were litigating the case. And I think that that's part of the strategy for how we might build things moving forward and moving our way out of this, is to remember that we have a range of strategies, but the central strategy is the human experience. It's the human being who is most affected by this. And if we lose that in the discussion about micro, macroeconomics and political things, we've lost more than we can afford to. Thank you.
So we should also mention tomorrow afternoon, since Vince has brought this up for us, we're having a workshop, the anatomy of that amazing campaign, so we can learn more about that effort. And I'm just also really struck by these comments about, given kind of how habitualized and routinized industrial punishment has become, it's treated as inevitable, as if there's no other option. Giving us strategies to think through how do we interrupt it at all of these levels, both legally, kind of morally, through the work we do to make claims that this is not the way we were meant to live, and to hold on to that. And it brings me to introduce our third speaker, Joy James, who's a professor of political science and humanities at Williams College, but has had an absolutely profound influence on shifting at least some folks, activist intellectuals who are based in US colleges and universities and beyond, to be able to link together the current moment of industrial punishment to much earlier and longer histories of labor control, gender control, and racial control. So she's the author of 3 amazing books on the subject, at least 5 edited volumes. And I have to say, you would think at a moment when we incarcerate 25% of the world's population, you might be able to go to an economics department or a political science department, and someone would have something to say about that. You could sit in an intro class to government, and someone might acknowledge it. And it's actually, sadly not the case. And Professor James has just had an enormous influence in not just legitimating this as a critical obligation for scholars and intellectuals and activists, but creating an intellectual vision for how we might link together the voices and writings and intellectual labor of people who are incarcerated to the political challenges we have today. So it's really a pleasure to welcome her here and to have her help us think about how we link all of these together. Professor Joy James.
Okay, so good afternoon, and of course our thoughts and prayers are with Cornel West and his family, and sorry that he could not be here. And I so appreciate this gathering and everyone here and what people have been contributing. And I also just want to clarify, not to contradict, but to clarify, all of my work is inspired by activists. And so much of what appears on page is actually the thoughts, the passions, the philosophies and theories, the commitments that appear in these types of forums. Unfortunately, you can't have like 100 people as an author. So it gets to be condensed as one. And I want to start with another contributor. His name is Amante. He's 14 years old, and I met him last May at a conference in Nashville, Tennessee on incarceration, a panel called School to Prison Pipeline. It's African American youth. And his phrase that stuck in my mind was, our mind is our most powerful thing, right? And actually it opens an essay on maroon philosophy that's talking about democracy, captivity. So we've heard great things about organizing strategies and also about legal strategies. And I kind of want to condense this and wrap up talking about conceptual strategies. Like if our minds are actually our most powerful gifts, then how do we think about our minds in strategic ways? And how do we communicate, obviously from our heart, obviously with our bodies, but also with this wealth and our ability to conceptualize freedom? Part of that, I'm convinced, is tied to how we remember things, how we situate ourselves, how we identify ourselves, and how we dream. So where we live, who we are, and what we dream, or our capacity to dream. And where we live is in a democracy that has a historical embeddedness in genocide, right? So there's a genocidal logic to the emergence of these United States of America. And I found that in writing, mostly academic writing, because that's what I read the most, right? But also in some organizing, our ability to have a language, to conceptualize a language that can actually speak to the horror. I thought your reading from Baldwin was, a graphic reminder, And actually, Michelle Alexander closes her important text, The New Jim Crow, quoting from Baldwin, I believe, A Fire Next Time. But for everyday language to speak about the connections of US history, through the Middle Passage, through enslavement, through anti-indigenous wars, right? Through the conscription of bodies into labor, through the Treaty of Guadalupe, through Asian immigration, to link that with structural violence, where you have markets of trauma and terror, not just economic incentives, right? But there's a kind of libidinal economies that unfold, that support the market, and rationalize the abuse and the rejection and the denigration of particular bodies. And to own that as part of our conceptual landscape and not to fear that ownership, but to say, okay, this is the legacy, this is the inheritance, I think is an important step in conceptual strategies. And for me, going back to language, I find the phrase racism to be too broad, so that even, it's unfortunate because my mind goes into little, marketing snapshots. So I was going to use the Tea Party as kind of like a little side joke, right? Even Tea Party members say they're anti-racist or they're not racist. But the word racism sometimes is such an open-ended category that everyone can claim to be in opposition to it, because the specificity of it, again, tied back to specific forms of exclusion, violence, and terror gets shorn. So I'm going to use the phrase white supremacy, because it works for me, okay? But if you read a work such as Cedric Robinson's Black Marxism, when he talks about capital and the formation of capital, and he uses the term racial capital, just to understand what this Middle Passage, what these wars of denigration, of colonization were like, that it wasn't capital in terms of pure accumulation of wealth. It was also the accumulation of what Cornel West has called existential wealth. It's accumulation of whiteness as privilege and power and the ability to dominate. Have others who are non-white or not fully white participated in it? Absolutely. And if we wanted to talk about the ways in which a sitting president and attorney general could further colonization schemes, right? And incarceration mandates, we would see that there's an equal opportunity here, right? But historically, it's embedded in whiteness and one's affinity and ties to whiteness. But I would move beyond what Cedric Robinson has offered in a very useful way of thinking about capital formation as also a racial mandate. And I would say it's important to talk about racial rape, right? So even if it's a phrase, if it's not fully codified or defined in ways that we can, use it, like incentivize and economize, et cetera, it's part of the phenomenon of the emergence of the United States of America. So if you read a text like Sharon Block's book, Rape and Sexual Power in Colonial America, she makes the argument, documented, by a study of legal cases, that the first uses of public terror visited upon the black body is not dated to the 19th century. Kind of the rise of lynching, this whole sequence that Alexander has given to us, but obviously others have given us to, enslavement, the end of Reconstruction, the rise of the convict prison lease system, disenfranchisement, lynching, terrorism through lynching. But the first appearance of the dismembered black body, the beheaded body, body parts strung out for public view as a cautionary tale, but also as a reassertion of control by those who were empowered as citizens, appears in New England in the 1700s. And the charge that allowed this form of public terror, which is part of our memory bank, even if it's submerged, the charge is rape. It's the rape of white women or girls, and the accused is black male. And her argument is in this text, which also is furthered in different ways by Kalomu Muhammad's The Condemnation of Blackness. What solidified early United States was this notion of a white citizenship, and the way that American law differed from British law, right, is that it stripped capital offense from rape from white males, and it visited solely upon black males. So tell me if I'm not making sense here, if I'm not fully communicating. Part of the emergence of laws that are racially driven, that are violent, are tied to the notions of white females as property, but who are also vulnerable, but it's only when black males are used as spectacles to be punished, right? That the capital offense, right? That executions are visited upon these bodies. And this, she argues, is part of what solidified white citizenship. The ability that, no, you're worthy of a democracy because there are others who are beyond the pale of democracy. We could fast forward through Khalil's book about the 19th century, about the early 20th century immigration. Again, this notion of the worthy or potentially worthy immigrant pitted against this particular form of outlying otherness, which is codified in the blackness. The point I want to make here is years ago in the 90s, I did this book, Resisting State Violence. And I'm convinced now I missed it by a mile. That it's not just the state, however we defined it, as an external agent that intrudes into our lives or the lives of our families, our communities. The state has bodily control. So it's better, I think, defined in my mind today as how we would resist state intimate violence. The way in which the state plays with our fears about sexual predators, which are real, right? But the ways in which rape has been racialized, the ways in which practically all crimes have been racialized, even though all people commit crime. The criminal is designated as a racial other, right? And if we don't acknowledge the terror that's visited disproportionately on the bodies of women and girls, women and children, also men, right? On both sides of razor wire, then we kind of miss what the state sees. That the ability to construct a democracy and to define a citizenship is based on the public's fear. And what the public fears is based on its race. And its notion of race is based on white supremacy. And that to market terror and trauma is profitable in this democracy, right? Which takes me from where we live to who we are as citizens, and I want to jump to the last because I know people have a lot to say. I think there's a difference between having dreams and having visions. And I think the state has extended itself into the interiority of our being, not through the way it plays with sexual violence as a spectacle or family trauma as a spectacle to market the need for more police, more courts, more draconian lives, draconian responses. But that it also has infiltrated our minds and our capacity to move our dreams into visions, right? And that the rage and the shame that comes from intergenerational trauma, intercommunal trauma, centuries old wedded to a state that has had a genocidal logic but lied about it from day one, really does affect the mental landscape. And so we are in a conceptual wilderness, which, you know, is okay with me. Because there is something about the Maroons, those multiracial, multi-ethnic, sometimes we don't speak the same language, collectives or collectivities that fled democracy because they recognized its logic. And they became the outliers of democracy. They became the borders. At the boundary, they understood that democracy is not synonymous with freedom. Democracy is the limitation. By defining a citizenship that is worthy, that most people, or a vast majority we could quantify or not, will not be able to attain because they don't have the existential wealth, they don't have the monetary wealth, and they don't have the ideological loyalty to an imperial democracy, right? So to be a Maroon, a fugitive in flight, is not always a bad thing. It can only mean at times, the best of times, that one is pursuing love. Thanks.
Thank you all. So I think they're ready for your thoughts, your engagement, your questions. And we have, I think, until about 4:45. So we have 20 minutes.